The red CNN ticker flashes beneath the screen. Live. The studio hums with polished tension, the kind that hides behind bright lights and perfect smiles. Jasmine Crockett is mid-sentence, her tone steady, her words measured, until Jake Tapper cuts her off. Congresswoman, with all due respect, the interruption lands like a slap disguised as civility. The air thickens. Cameras adjust, zooming in just enough to catch the flicker in Jasmine's eyes. One of the panelists shifts uncomfortably. The control room murmurs. It's a soundless tension only live television can hold. That moment when millions lean closer to their screens, sensing something about to break. Jake's voice, usually smooth, sharpens as he presses in again. Let's stay factual here. You're making this personal. There it is. The tone. Condescending. Patronizing, wrapped in the language of professionalism, but carrying the old weight of dismissal. Jasmine doesn't flinch. She doesn't blink. Instead, she lets the silence stretch, heavy and deliberate, the kind that makes even the lights seem to hum louder. Every second becomes a countdown. Jake adjusts his papers, impatient. The panel watches, unsure whether to intervene or brace for impact. The camera catches her expression, calm, calculating, a storm behind still eyes. When she finally speaks, it's not rushed or defensive. Her voice is soft, precise, every word landing like a gavel. Jake, if you're going to interrupt, at least make sure you're right. A pause. Then silence. The kind that feels like a held breath across the entire country. The control room freezes. Jake's smirk fades just slightly. The tension doesn't explode, it implodes. Jasmine leans forward, her tone still even, her posture unshaken. The balance of power in the room has shifted, not through volume, but through composure. The screen flickers with her face, lit not by spotlight, but by something more powerful, the certainty of a woman who refuses to be diminished. And as viewers across the nation grip their phones, clipping, tweeting, sharing, one question echoes louder than the rest. But what she said next didn't just silence the studio. It sent shockwaves through every newsroom in America. What unfolded on live television wasn't an accident. It was years in the making, the collision of two Americas inside one broadcast. For decades, political talk shows have dressed themselves in objectivity while carrying an unspoken hierarchy. Voices like Jake Tapper's, seasoned, polished, confident, have long dominated the airwaves. Voices like Jasmine Crockett's, sharp, unapologetic, and unafraid to challenge the script, are too often treated as guests rather than equals. This segment was supposed to be about accountability. Jake opened the discussion with statistics, reports, and sound bites about political ethics, each question sharpened like a blade. But beneath the surface was something else, a tone that said, "I'll let you speak, but only if you stay within my lines." When Jasmine spoke, she didn't just repeat talking points. She reframed the argument. She spoke of justice as lived experience, not theory. Her words carried weight, not because of volume, but because they threatened the comfort of the usual narrative. And that's when it happened. The interruptions, the subtle sighs, the impatient glances, the attempt to reassert control. Jake's interjections weren't overtly hostile. They were the kind that come wrapped in civility. Let's be clear. Actually, the data says, "I just want to correct that." Each phrase sounded professional, but every viewer could feel what was really happening. The tug to silence, to steer, to reframe. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't retreat. She waited, breathing through the chaos. And when she spoke again, her words carried a quiet authority that didn't need permission. In that moment, the rhythm of the conversation shifted. The man who had built his career controlling the flow of dialogue suddenly found himself reacting instead of leading. It wasn't just about one journalist or one guest. It was about a pattern that countless women of color knew too well. Being interrupted mid-thought, spoken over, corrected for tone, and then told they were too defensive. Jake Tapper, without realizing it, became the face of that pattern, not out of malice, but out of habit. The kind of arrogance that hides behind intellect. And Jasmine? She became something else entirely, a mirror. Her composure exposed not only his bias, but the quiet endurance it takes to remain calm in a room built to test your patience. By the time the exchange reached its boiling point, the audience wasn't just watching a disagreement. They were witnessing a shift. The old journalistic guard, armed with smug certainty, facing a generation that refuses to play small. She didn't need to out-talk him. She just needed to outlast him. And she did, effortlessly, because every clipped word, every patronizing interruption only amplified her poise. And that's when viewers realized this wasn't about debate decorum anymore. It was about who gets to define the truth when the cameras are rolling. But this wasn't just an interview gone wrong. It was the latest chapter in a battle for who gets to define the truth on national TV. Long before that live segment, Jake Tapper had already built a legacy. He was the archetype of the serious journalist. Sharp suit, steady tone, and a reputation polished over decades. From his early days as a field reporter chasing political chaos in Washington, to his rise as CNN's flagship anchor, Tapper had become synonymous with authority. His voice carried weight. His interruptions were gospel, and for years no one questioned it. He'd been celebrated as the man who held both sides accountable, the journalist who wouldn't bend to pressure. But somewhere along the line, that impartiality began to look less like balance and more like performance. His interviews became viral not for revelation, but for spectacle. His tone, once inquisitive, hardened into something closer to judgment. The camera loved him. The establishment trusted him, and Jake believed in that trust. He believed that his years of experience granted him an unspoken license to direct, to correct, to steer every narrative into the box of what he deemed credible. The audience mistook it for strength. His colleagues mistook it for leadership. But those who came face to face with him, especially those who didn't fit the mold, felt the other side of that charm. The quiet condescension, the smirk just before interruption, the tone that said, "I've already decided what matters here." There were moments, televised and archived, where critics caught glimpses of that arrogance. A congresswoman cut off mid-thought. A civil rights activist corrected with half-context statistics. A working-class guest treated like a talking point instead of a person. Each time, Jake walked away unscathed. He'd lean back, adjust his tie, and remind viewers of his decades of fact-based journalism. It wasn't malice. It was comfort. The comfort of a man so used to being right that he forgot how to listen. And that's what made him dangerous, in a quiet way, not as a villain who plotted, but as one who didn't have to. His dominance was institutional. He was part of a lineage, the gatekeepers of discourse, those who set the boundaries of what was reasonable on national television. They didn't shout down dissent. They dismissed it with poise. To Jake, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another guest. She was a challenge to the structure he'd mastered. He'd faced politicians, scholars, and pundits, but rarely someone who refused to play his game. His authority, built on decades of unchallenged control, would soon be tested by someone who didn't seek his validation. Even in that fateful interview, the signs were there. The slight tilt of his head when she spoke too confidently. The practiced smile that appeared every time she used emotion instead of data. To him, passion was bias, but to her, it was truth, the lived kind that statistics couldn't capture. Jake prided himself on neutrality, but neutrality had become his armor. It shielded him from accountability. Every deflection, every "let's not get emotional," reinforced the unspoken rule that only his tone was credible. Only his framing was objective. He had no idea that this would be the moment it cracked, because sitting across from him was someone who understood that every pause, every interruption, every smirk wasn't just about her. It was about power. In that moment, Jake represented something larger than himself, the gatekeepers who had controlled the national conversation for a generation, men who mistook volume for dominance, interruption for insight, and restraint for superiority. His confidence, though genuine, carried the weight of 1,000 unchecked assumptions. The irony was poetic. The very traits that made Jake Tapper respected, his polish, his authority, his certainty, were about to become the source of his undoing. He wasn't prepared for a guest who didn't flinch, didn't apologize, and didn't wait for permission to finish her thought. And as the red light blinked on and the cameras rolled, Jake leaned forward with that familiar air of control, unaware that this time, it would be his own words used against him. But the woman sitting across from him wasn't intimidated. She was prepared to turn his own words into her weapon. Long before the bright lights of CNN, Jasmine Crockett learned how to speak truth in rooms that didn't want to hear it. She grew up in a working-class neighborhood where voices like hers weren't often amplified. They were tested. Her parents taught her the value of persistence, of showing up even when no one invited you, of standing firm even when your voice trembled. In those early years, Jasmine learned that dignity wasn't granted. It was earned word by word, choice by choice. When she walked into law school, she wasn't armed with privilege or connections, only purpose. While others rehearsed polished arguments for moot court, Jasmine spent late nights at her desk, balancing textbooks with volunteer case files from the local legal aid center. She wasn't chasing prestige. She was chasing justice. She saw how the law on paper promised equality, but in practice it often protected the powerful. That contradiction fueled her. There were moments of isolation. Professors who mistook her passion for aggression. Classmates who smirked when she challenged their hypotheticals about marginalized communities. But Jasmine didn't soften her tone to make others comfortable. She refined it, sharpened it, until her conviction carried more weight than their condescension. After graduation, she didn't choose a lucrative firm or a D.C. lobby job. She went home, back to Texas, to defend those who couldn't afford a voice. Her law office became a revolving door for the unheard. Single mothers fighting eviction, teenagers targeted for petty crimes, families suffocating under bureaucracy. She didn't just argue cases. She lived them. Every win, no matter how small, was a rebellion against the expectation that people like her should know their place. And when politics came calling, it wasn't ambition that drew her. It was exhaustion. Exhaustion from watching the same injustices recycled under new slogans. When she ran for office, the odds were against her. The establishment didn't take her seriously. Pundits dismissed her as too raw, too direct, too emotional. But the people, the ones she had fought for, recognized something the cameras couldn't stage. Authenticity. Every campaign stop felt like a continuation of the same fight. Community centers, church basements, street corners, and school gymnasiums. She didn't talk at people. She talked with them. Her words weren't rehearsed sound bites. They were lived experience. When she won her seat in Congress, it wasn't a victory for a politician. It was a victory for every unseen worker, every silenced woman, every kid told that this system isn't built for you. But victory didn't mean peace. Washington tried to tame her, to fold her into the routine. Scripted press statements, cautious language, the constant pressure to tone it down. She refused. Her office lights stayed on long after the corridors emptied. Staffers remember her drafting amendments by hand at midnight, fueled by coffee and conviction, determined to make policies more than paperwork. The backlash came. Online trolls, political opponents, even media pundits. The hate was loud, coordinated, and often cruel. But Jasmine didn't fight back with outrage. She fought with precision. Every insult became an opportunity to educate, every smear an invitation to clarify. Her rebuttals weren't defensive. They were disarming. Calm, factual, unshakable, that's what made her different. Jasmine didn't perform composure. She was composure. In the chaos of cable news, where emotion is currency and outrage sells, she carried an aura that couldn't be manufactured. Her calm wasn't passivity, it was control. Control of her tone, her timing, her truth. Colleagues began to notice. Journalists, too. They couldn't quite label her. She wasn't the angry, progressive stereotype they expected. She was something more dangerous to the establishment, articulate, fearless, and utterly unbothered by power's pretense. So when that CNN invitation arrived, another primetime debate framed as a balanced discussion, Jasmine knew what it meant. It wasn't balance. It was a test. She'd seen the pattern too many times. frame a strong woman of color as emotional, then interrupt her mid-thought to reclaim control. But she wasn't walking into that studio as a guest. She was walking in as someone who had earned her place, and knew it. The makeup artist dabbed at her cheek under the hot studio lights, but Jasmine's focus wasn't on appearances. Her mind was already dissecting the topic: accountability, fairness, the very things she'd built her career defending. She knew Jake Tapper's reputation: smooth, skeptical, confident to a fault. And she knew exactly how he'd try to steer the conversation. When the camera started rolling, her heart didn't race. She'd been through far worse battles, real ones, off-camera, where the stakes weren't ratings but rights. Every courtroom, every late-night policy fight, every headline spun against her had prepared her for this. The audience saw a composed Congresswoman. But behind that steady gaze was the weight of years spent earning the right to speak and the discipline to never let someone take that voice away again. So when Jake Tapper leaned forward with that practiced smirk, expecting her to stumble, to soften, to yield, Jasmine didn't flinch. She leaned in, calm but commanding, eyes steady, voice low but lethal. He thought this was another segment. She knew it was something else entirely, a reckoning. So when Jake Tapper leaned forward with that smirk, expecting her to back down, he had no idea what was coming next. The tension didn't build gradually. It struck like a spark in a dry room. 1 second, the conversation flowed with guarded civility. The next, Jake Tapper's voice sliced through Jasmine's mid-sentence. "Congresswoman, that's not exactly accurate." The interruption was so abrupt it startled the panel. His tone was smooth, measured, the kind of interruption disguised as professionalism. Jasmine blinked once, her expression unreadable. He continued, leaning slightly forward. "If we're being honest here, your claim about systemic bias..." She tilted her head slightly, eyes fixed on him, not blinking, not retreating. The camera caught the smallest twitch in her jaw. Restraint, not anger. The studio lights burned brighter in the silence that followed, reflecting off her poised composure. Across the table, a panelist shifted in their seat, sensing the air thickening. The audience couldn't see it, but every heartbeat in that studio seemed to sink. Waiting. Jake pressed again, sharper this time. "Let's stay with facts, not feelings. Are you suggesting that word, feelings, hung in the air like smoke?" Jasmine breathed in slowly, the kind of breath that doesn't concede. It prepares. "Jake," she began, her tone even, deliberate, unhurried. "I'm suggesting that lived reality is a fact. It just doesn't fit neatly into the kind of script you're used to controlling." A ripple moved through the panel. One commentator's eyebrows rose. Another shifted papers just to do something with their hands. Jake chuckled, polite but performative. "Well, respectfully, Congresswoman, that's not how journalism works." Jasmine smiled faintly, almost kindly. "And that's exactly the problem." It was surgical. One sentence delivered like a scalpel, not a sword. Her voice didn't climb, her posture didn't shift. She simply owned the silence that followed. Jake recovered quickly, trying to reclaim footing. "I just think we have to separate emotion from evidence, that's all." "Do we?" she replied. "Or do we just separate discomfort from accountability?" The question wasn't asked for him. It was asked for everyone watching. The panel fell quiet. The producer's voice buzzed faintly in Jake's earpiece, but even he didn't respond. He was locked in, now visibly uneasy, trying to mask it behind another fact-check attempt. "Well, Congresswoman, statistically speaking..." But she didn't let him finish this time. Not by talking over him, but by holding the moment. She waited, calmly, letting his own words hang incomplete. Then, softly, she said, "It's interesting how often the statistics only surface when the truth becomes inconvenient." The control was absolute. She wasn't reacting, she was directing. The audience could feel the power shift. Jake leaned back, clearing his throat, adjusting his tie, small movements of a man aware the camera was catching what his words couldn't cover. The segment had turned. What began as an interruption had become an unraveling. Every time he tried to reframe her words, Jasmine gently pivoted, refusing to be boxed in. Each sentence of hers landed with precision. Never emotional, always exact. And yet there was emotion, not from her voice, but from its steadiness. From the way she refused to play the game he'd designed. Panelists exchanged glances. One of them mouthed a silent wow. The control room caught the moment and cut to a close-up of Jasmine's face. Still, confident, radiant under the harsh light. Jake tried one final time. But Congresswoman, surely you'd agree that the media, she raised a hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to still the noise. Jake, I don't need to agree or disagree with the media. I'm just asking why truth needs your permission to be heard. The air broke open. You could almost hear the collective intake of breath, in the studio, on social media, across living rooms tuning in live. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't rehearsed. It was real. Jake blinked, for once without a comeback. His practiced smirk faltered. He reached for his notes, as if the paper might anchor him back into control. But the balance had already shifted. Jasmine wasn't the guest anymore. She was the gravity of the room. Every lens, every heartbeat, every ounce of attention was hers. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was reverent. And then, in just 13 words, she delivered the line that shattered his composure and lit up the internet. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Not a breath, not a flicker of light. Jake Tapper's polished words had collided with something immovable. Jasmine Crockett's silence. It wasn't empty. It was charged. It was the pause before history rewrote itself. Then, softly she spoke. You keep asking for evidence. Jake, she began, her voice low but steady. But every time someone like me brings it, you question the tone. Not the truth. The camera didn't cut away. It couldn't. The director in the control room must have sensed it, that this was no longer an interview, but an inflection point. Jasmine leaned forward, not confrontational, but deliberate. Her words were chosen like stones placed into a foundation. You've built a career teaching America how to listen to power. But maybe tonight, power needs to learn how to listen back. The studio air thinned. One assistant in the corner blinked rapidly, clutching a clipboard as if it might steady her. A panelist glanced at the floor, realizing this wasn't about politics anymore. It was about something bigger. Jake shifted in his chair, tried to reclaim rhythm. Congresswoman, But Jasmine didn't need volume to overtake him. Her calm became command. No, let's finish this thought. Because every time a woman of color raises her voice, she's labeled emotional. When she doesn't, she's called evasive. Either way, the truth gets interrupted. Each word landed with precision, too logical to dismiss, too graceful to attack. Jake's confidence, that anchor's poise crafted over decades of live broadcast, began to unravel in micro moments. A twitch of the eye, a too long blink, the clearing of a suddenly dry throat. Jasmine continued. You say you stand for accountability, and I believe you do. But accountability has to start in the mirror, Jake. When you decide whose voice deserves space, you're not reporting, you're editing reality. There it was. The hit that didn't sound like one. Not a shout, not a soundbite, but something surgical and final. The kind of truth that doesn't just land. It lodges. The panel sat motionless. The air hummed with the sound of moral gravity settling. The studio's clock ticked audibly, a rare intrusion into the broadcast silence. Jake tried to smile, but the smirk had melted into something else, an attempt at recovery. Well, Congresswoman, I think viewers can make up their own minds. Her gaze softened, almost sympathetic. They already are, Jake. They always have. The question is, when will the gatekeepers stop being afraid of what the people actually see? There was no anger in it, no venom. Just truth, stripped bare and delivered with elegance. It was the kind of response you couldn't refute without sounding smaller for trying. The camera lingered on her face. Even the lighting seemed to favor her, calm, assured, luminous. She wasn't performing. She was embodying something timeless. Jake looked down at his notes, realizing the paper no longer mattered. Every bullet point, every planned pivot had dissolved in that silence that followed. One of the producers whispered through his earpiece, Wrap soon. But Jake didn't move. He stared at Jasmine for a moment, then back to the camera. You could almost see the gears turning, the veteran journalist realizing the story had slipped from his control. Jasmine, sensing it, leaned back slightly, her composure untouched. "See, Jake," she added softly, "the truth doesn't need a permission slip. It just needs someone who refuses to talk over it." That was it. 13 words, the ones that broke the broadcast. The control room froze, unsure whether to cut to commercial or stay with the moment. The hesitation lasted only seconds, but online, those seconds were everything. A clip hit Twitter before the segment even ended. Within minutes, hashtags started rising. Was Crockett Clapback? Doc Stay Calm Speak Truth? Jake Got Taught? Screens lit up across the country. Edits, memes, reaction videos, a digital wave of vindication. In living rooms and classrooms, on buses and in coffee shops, people replayed her words. The soundbite, those 13 quiet, devastating words, became a mantra. You could see it on faces scrolling through phones. Finally, one tweet read, "This wasn't just a clapback. It was history correcting itself in real time." Another said, "Jasmine Crockett just did what every woman interrupted on live TV dreams of doing, staying silent long enough to make the truth louder than any anchor's ego, even rival." Commentators, usually divided on everything, paused to acknowledge the moment. One conservative pundit tweeted, "Disagree with her politics, but that composure, that was masterful." Meanwhile, back in the studio, Jake Tapper adjusted his microphone, trying to recover the rhythm of professionalism. But everyone watching could see it. His confidence was cracked. His authority momentarily humanized. He closed the segment with his signature sign-off, but his voice trembled just enough for the world to hear it. "We'll be right back after the break." The red light went off. Silence again. Only this time it wasn't awkward. It was reflective. The kind of silence that means everyone in that room understood they had witnessed something irreversible. A young assistant in the corner exhaled, whispering to no one in particular, "She really did that." Jasmine stood, calm as ever, gathered her notes and smiled politely at the crew. No gloating, no visible satisfaction, just quiet, grounded confidence. Jake muttered a half-hearted compliment. "Good segment, Congresswoman," but even he knew it sounded hollow. She nodded once. "Thank you, Jake. Always good to have a conversation." Conversation. That word lingered as she walked off set, heels clicking against the studio floor. Behind her, the hum of the screens and soft chatter filled the room again. But nothing sounded quite the same. In the control booth, a producer whispered, "That's going to trend for days. He was wrong." It would trend for weeks. Because what Jasmine Crockett did in those 13 words wasn't just defend herself. She reframed the meaning of power on live television. It wasn't noise that won. It was clarity. It wasn't anger that triumphed. It was intellect armed with grace. And as the clip continued to ricochet across every platform, people weren't just watching. They were recognizing themselves in her composure. Every teacher who'd been talked over. Every activist who'd been dismissed. Every voice told to lower its tone to be heard. Jasmine had spoken for all of them. Not by raising her voice, but by refusing to lower her worth. The viral flood didn't just celebrate a clapback, it crowned a shift, from performance to principle, from gatekeeping to truth-speaking. And as the CNN logo faded on screens across the country, one truth had already taken root in millions of minds. When arrogance meets integrity, arrogance always blinks first. But as the segment ended, the real explosion wasn't in that studio, it was online. The moment the segment ended, the internet detonated. Within minutes, timelines were flooded, notifications pulsing like wildfire. Clips of Jasmine Crockett's calm dismantling of Jake Tapper spread faster than any CNN headline could ever hope to travel. On TikTok, creators stitched her words with captions like 13 words that shook the media and "When calm becomes the loudest mic drop in history." Millions watched, rewatched, and replayed, not because it was sensational, but because it was satisfying. It felt like balance being restored. Hashtags surged across platforms. Where Crockett Clapback, Wayne Tapper Takedown, Respect the Voice, Stay Calm, Speak Truth. Each one pulsed with digital energy, a collective exhale from people who'd grown tired of watching voices like Jasmine's talked over, dismissed, or drowned out in professional tone. Clips from the interview climbed to the top of YouTube's trending list within hours. The thumbnail, Jasmine leaning slightly forward, composed and unbothered, Jake mid-blink, became symbolic. Every pause in her delivery was being analyzed, celebrated, quoted like scripture. On Twitter, a journalist wrote, "This wasn't a clash. It was a recalibration." Another followed with, "Crockett didn't raise her voice. She raised the bar." Then came the flood of celebrity reactions. Viola Davis tweeted a single word, poise. Ava DuVernay reposted the clip with the caption, "When you've done the work, the truth speaks for you." Even sports figures joined in. LeBron James retweeted a fan edit of the exchange with fire emojis and the comment, "This is how you handle pressure." But beyond the glitter of Hollywood and blue-check approval, the reaction from everyday viewers was even more powerful. Nurses on break, teachers grading papers, parents scrolling after midnight, all saying the same thing in different words. "She said what we all wanted to say?" Comments poured in from every corner of the country. "She didn't argue, she educated. She showed what real strength looks like. She didn't just win the debate, she reclaimed the space." For many, the moment became more than politics. It became personal. Meanwhile, mainstream commentators scrambled to interpret the shockwave. Some called it a needed reckoning for journalistic bias. Others framed it as a teachable moment in live media accountability. Ice. Few tried to downplay it, claiming Jake Tapper was taken out of context. But even those voices sounded defensive, aware the tide had turned. Morning shows played the clip on loop. Headlines rolled out, Crockett silences. Tapper, the exchange America can't stop watching. Grace under fire, how one Congresswoman redefined the debate. Panel discussions sprouted overnight. Political analysts dissected Jasmine's tone, pacing, and precision. Was it premeditated? Was it instinct? How had she stayed so composed under live pressure? One communications expert said it best. That was rhetorical judo. She used his momentum against him and made him fall without throwing a punch. And while pundits analyzed, millions of viewers simply felt it. They felt the release of watching someone who looked like them, sounded like them, or carried their frustrations finally standing unshaken in the face of establishment condescension. In barbershops, classrooms, and office Slack chats, her name came up like a symbol. "Did you see Crockett last night?" became the new morning greeting. Late-night hosts joined in too. One quipped, "Jake Tapper learned what every man learns eventually. Interrupting a smart woman rarely ends well." The audience roared. But not all the noise was applause. There were critics, the usual suspects who cried disrespect or identity politics. Editorials popped up accusing Jasmine of being combative. But those takes only added fuel. Every attempt to downplay her composure made it more obvious how threatened the old guard felt by poise that couldn't be patronized. The deeper truth was undeniable. It wasn't about one moment. It was about what that moment represented. Generations of silenced voices watched someone meet arrogance with elegance and win. Clips from civil rights speeches resurfaced online, juxtaposed with Jasmine's line, "The truth doesn't need a permission slip." The parallels were impossible to. Missed academics called it a modern act of rhetorical resistance. Activists called it a blueprint for televised dignity. And for millions, it was a reminder that progress doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it speaks calmly into a live mic and makes history listen. As the weekend rolled in, the momentum didn't fade. It multiplied. CNN's YouTube replay crossed 10 million views in 48 hours. Memes turned her serene expression into a cultural emblem. Jasmine Crockett, unbothered, unshaken, undefeated. Merchandise even appeared. T-shirts that read, The truth doesn't need permission, and stay calm, speak truth. The profits from fan sellers were donated to youth civic programs, amplifying the ripple she'd started. In classrooms, teachers played the clip to discuss confidence under pressure. In churches, pastors referenced her composure as a lesson in grace. By Sunday morning, every major outlet had covered it. But none could fully explain why it resonated so deeply, because this wasn't just about one exchange between a congresswoman and a journalist. It was about seeing a dynamic shift, a cultural correction long overdue. For once, interruption didn't win. For once, the calm voice wasn't dismissed. The next time Jake Tapper appeared on air, even he seemed different, more cautious, more aware of the weight his interruptions carried. And though he'd never admit it, viewers could sense he'd been changed by that moment too, because power had shifted, and everyone watching knew it, and in all the noise, one truth began to rise louder than the rest. As the noise faded and the headlines began to settle, something quieter, something deeper, started to take hold. The replayed clip no longer felt like breaking news. It felt like a parable. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just won an exchange on national television. She'd redefined what winning even looked like. In an era obsessed with volume, she proved that strength can whisper. Her words weren't about humiliation or domination. They were about truth, the kind that doesn't need to be performed, only lived. She showed that conviction isn't proven by who talks the loudest, but by who refuses to be moved when it matters most. The beauty of her response was its simplicity. No theatrics, no retaliation, just principle wrapped in composure. It was the kind of dignity that disarms arrogance without ever lowering itself to its level, the kind that turns interruption into introspection. For years, women, especially women of color, had been told to temper their tone, to not take it personally, to play by rules written to silence them. But Jasmine's presence on that CNN stage rewrote those unspoken laws. She didn't demand space, she embodied it. Every pause, every deliberate breath was a declaration. I belong here, and you will listen. Her calm didn't just silence Jake Tapper. It quieted something larger. A long-standing presumption that authority only looks one way, speaks one way, or holds one kind of voice. In her stillness, she exposed the fragility of that illusion. When viewers revisited the clip, they saw more than a political moment. They saw an emotional truth about power, that arrogance collapses under its own weight when confronted with grace. That real power doesn't interrupt, it understands. It doesn't humiliate. It enlightens, and that's why the impact stretched far beyond the studio. It resonated in classrooms, in offices, in families, anywhere someone had ever been talked over and wished they'd stayed calm instead of shrinking. Jasmine's poise became a mirror, reflecting what restraint can look like when it's powered by righteousness instead of fear. This wasn't just a battle of words. It was a quiet revolution, a reminder that integrity doesn't need applause. It creates its own echo. What she modeled that night wasn't a strategy. It was a value system. A belief that respect is not something you earn by shouting louder, but something you command by being unshakably yourself. For her supporters, the moment wasn't just empowering, it was healing. It showed that grace can be sharper than ego, that humility can be the loudest form of resistance, and that sometimes the most radical act is to remain dignified when the world expects you to explode. Because in the end, this story was never about Jake Tapper losing composure. It was about Jasmine Crockett proving that the truth never needs to rush. It waits, it listens, and when it finally speaks, it changes everything. The clip that millions watched wasn't merely political theater. It was a study in leadership, leadership that uplifts instead of belittles, that asserts without aggression. That reminds us what real accountability sounds like. And perhaps that's why the image of her that night lingers, not as a headline, but as a lesson. The way she looked into the camera after her final line, steady and unbothered, carried the message more powerful than any soundbite. That dignity, once spoken, doesn't fade. It multiplies. In a media landscape that rewards outrage, Jasmine Crockett's calm became an act of rebellion. She proved that composure can be contagious, that it can silence arrogance not with fury, but with focus. And long after the hashtags stopped trending, that's what people will remember, not the interruption, but the response. Not the noise, but the silence that followed it. Because when arrogance meets integrity, history never forgets who stayed silent last. The clip replays one last time. Jake Tapper's voice cutting in mid-sentence. Jasmine Crockett's eyes lifting in steady defiance. The interruption that was meant to control the conversation instead becomes the spark that rewrote it. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was absolute. The kind that only truth can command. Cameras captured it. Millions replayed it. But what made it unforgettable wasn't the clash. It was the calm. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. And as the segment faded out, she didn't look shaken or triumphant, just grounded, as if she'd said exactly what needed to be said, nothing more, nothing less. Now imagine the final cinematic moment. Studio lights dim. Jake shuffles his notes, trying to regain footing. The control room murmurs. But Jasmine stands, smooths her jacket, and walks off with quiet confidence, leaving behind a silence louder than any applause. That's the moment that echoed across screens and hearts alike. Because every time dignity wins over arrogance, another wall of silence breaks. Her words weren't just a comeback, they were a call. A reminder that truth doesn't need permission to speak, and respect isn't granted, it's claimed. So don't just watch this story. Share it. Share it with someone who's ever been interrupted, underestimated, or told to stay in their place. Because every share, every comment, every voice added to this moment turns it into something bigger. A movement of fearless truth-tellers who refuse to be silenced. If you believe in integrity over ego, in truth over theatrics, subscribe, join the conversation, and stand with those who speak power with grace. Because when dignity speaks, the world listens.